Welcome to Post-burnout.com interviews. My name is Aaron Kavanagh and I'm the website's founder and editor-in-chief. Post-burnout.com is a culture website dedicated to venerating burnt-out artists the world over. Our interviews are mainly recorded to be transcribed, but every now and again we release the audio in a series we call Post-burnout.com interviews. If you enjoy what we do, be sure to subscribe. In this edition of Post-burnout.com interviews, we speak with Michael Tao, the author of the book Extreme Music, From Silence to Noise to Everything in Between. The book explores extreme genres of music and the people who make it. We discuss the book, the ethics of some of the recordings featured in the book, how Michael's background as a psychologist influenced the book, the anthropological study of the book, AI music, the future of music, the limitless possibility of music, and more. So when I was reading your book, Extreme Music, I elected not to look at any of the additional press you were doing, instead just choosing to interview you based on the text from the book itself. One thing I think the book succeeded in was saying, setting out your thesis and sticking with it. But one thing I felt I didn't really get from your book was a sense of who you are as the author and how what the kind of impetus was for this book. I was wondering if maybe you could explain that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So it's a big question. Let me figure out how I want to frame this. So, at the core, the book is driven by my curiosity about some of the unusual and extreme music that I'd been exploring over many years. I got into experimental music when I was a teenager, listening to a radio show called Brave New Waves, which would play from midnight until 4 a.m. So I used to tape it with cassettes from the radio. And then throughout my high school years and beyond, I would write about, interview, review music, including a lot of music on the experimental fringe. But I always found myself fascinated by, wondering what the stories are behind some of the more extreme and unusual musical concepts that have been produced, and the stories behind them, the motivations for the people, the motivations of the people behind these things. So this book was essentially a kind of long-standing project I had running in the background over many years, where I would just email people or reach out to them and ask them, like, how did this come to be? What is the story behind the unusual idea behind your 5 quintillion year long composition, or your CDR that comes buried in a package of rotten pasta? I think I'm not sure. So I think in terms of why I'm interested is I think inherently I'm curious to know about ideas and concepts, and I'm always curious to know more about people and their intentions and how to explain their behavior, which is probably in part why I'm also a psychiatrist, but certainly why I'm interested in this these kind of unusual musical ideas.
Yeah, when I was reading the book, there is a lot of concepts about music production as well as music theory and various other like actual kind of industry details. I was wondering how much of that did you know, how much of you had experience in, and how much of it was just purely research for this book?
How much I had, sorry,
Did you
just
have any kind of prior experience too? So, for example, you're explaining, like the book begins with you explaining the sound wars, for example, and you have to talk a little bit about music production in order to kind of to get that idea across. So, like, how much of that, how much kind of like musical knowledge did you have in that aspect versus how much of it was just solely based on research?
Very minimal, very minimal. So I don't have like a background in, as a recording engineer or anything like that. Actually, would you mind 1 second? I just need to,
Okay.
I'm getting a page from the hospital. Give me 1 second.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
So sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Do you have to go or?
No, it was just just a page I needed to deal with.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so as I was saying, so your background in engineering, you had none. So when it came to kind of, did you feel, I guess, confident in terms of transcribing that process maybe coming from it as sort of an autodidact, perhaps.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, my approach was to read about it, to learn about it. I even, dug up some papers from like audio engineering journals. And so, like, I think a big theme of my book is it's not overly technical. It's not overly like focused on theory. It's not written in an academic way. Um, so, it's possible that an audio engineer would read that chapter and say, like, well, this is wrong and this is wrong. I'm not sure. But my goal was simply to convey some of the core concepts in a readable way, like in the same way that I understand them.
Sure.
Um, yeah.
I think like yeah, I mean, I think writing about music can be somewhat abstract, especially when you don't have like an auditory aid to go along with it. Maybe with in the case of like an
Hmm.
audiobook, it could perhaps work. But I think when you're talking about written work, I know for my writing it can be very difficult too. One thing
Yeah.
I think I think you're a very good writer in terms of uh, like getting those ideas across and being didactic. The one example I was noting was you're talking about speed core, and you talk about how it went up to 500 beats per minute, which can be quite abstract. So you said, well,
Hmm.
that's 8 beats per second. So just try and tap your thumb really quick 8 times. So did
Hmm.
you find like, yeah, did you find like you had to do kind of mental gymnastics in order to try and, convey some of that information?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Like, I don't know about you. I actually think, your website is great. I really like your writing style, and I really like the concept behind it. And I think you may agree that like reviews or music writing that just describes how something sounds is like a lot of it can be kind of dry to read. And nowadays, when people can just look things up on YouTube, it's sort of there's like less point to describe like this is a mid-tempo song and the guitar sound like right. So instead, I try to make the focus less on how things sounded, except in very pragmatic terms. Like, for example, try to tap your finger 8 times, right? Which I think is just easier to digest and more inherently interesting. Um, so yeah, I guess I would try when possible to come up with either metaphors that help explain things or just like simple descriptions like try tapping your fingers eight times a second.
Yeah. When it came to actually choosing the genres, I mean, obviously you have to do kind of editorial process, and I guess you can split hairs over the definition of extreme. Like how would you kind of define that? I guess. But yeah, what I was kind of wondering was like, um, yeah, when you obviously have to do an editorial process in choosing which genres to write about. How did you go about that? And do you think if potentially you wanted to make it a series, do you think you'd have more for like a second or a third book even?
Hmm. Um, yeah, so how the book started was like a file folder on my computer with a bunch of Word documents, and the Word documents were just the core concepts. Like I had one for found music, I had one for really fast music. And as I would sort of collect my thoughts and organize things, I'd create a new Word document or I might merge them um, in order to try to put some organizational system on everything. I think one of the things that's easy to misunderstand about the book is, and this is my folly in calling it extreme music, is you read it and you would assume that it's like going to be a description of, you know, extreme metal genres or power electronics, genres that are extreme. Whereas really the book is about like conceptual extremes as they manifest in the music world. So I imagine some people are probably disappointed that, there's no chapter on black metal.
Mhm.
Um, but there's books about black, like all of those things have a lot of writing about them that already exists. So really the book is more about conceptual extremes. And so my job was just to try to think of different genres or scenes that represented conceptual extremes, and then explore them as best I could. There were some chapters that I had started and then I didn't finish or I just chose to exclude. So I was going to do one about plunderphonics as kind of a sidebar from the found music chapter, but in the end, I scrapped that idea both because there are other things written about plunderphonics and because it's hard to dissociate that from just the concept of sampling in music as a whole, which um, obviously that's like a huge topic that's outside of the dominion of my book. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question,
It does.
but it was an evolving process. I don't know if I were to extend it, I don't know that there could be another volume, but potentially if there was another edition of the book, I might make some changes and add some topics. Got any ideas?
Yeah, I'll let you know. Not the top of my head. Yeah, well, I think you did, like you were mentioning earlier, you kind of took this from a kind of anthropological kind of standpoint where you're trying to humanize it. I think like an interesting one is like harsh noise wall, where it's like it seems like
Mhm.
so absurd when you listen to it. It's like I don't know, just television static. It's like the beginning of Poltergeist or something. You're like, why would someone listen to this? And then you kind of just talk to people who are in that scene. You kind of you humanize it. I think you humanize the music. You give it a sense of I don't know, you kind of personify it, I think, in a little way. I was wondering how many of these genres were you familiar with prior to doing research, and what was the kind of, I guess, what were the genres that kind of sparked the initial interest, I guess.
hmm Yeah, that's a great question. So certainly harsh noise wall was a genre I was aware of before I started writing this book because for many years I would write do reviews, interview. I used to run a zine, so I had come across harsh noise wall and reviewed different harsh noise wall um, tapes and things. I even put out a harsh noise wall tape at one point, um, but more as an experiment than anything else. So so that was something that I knew about before. Some of the genres of vaporwave I learned about while putting the book together. I have a soft spot for that chapter, even though it's a little bit of a departure from the topic, from extreme music concepts. And I imagine some people are like, why is this in the book? But I just felt it was so interesting, I couldn't not include it. So yeah, part of the topics were things that I knew about before, and some of the topics were things I learned about along the way as I was just exploring things. And I do have a fair number of harsh noise wall cassettes in my personal collection at home, although I can't say I listen to them very frequently, partially because my tape player broke a little while ago.
Oh, yeah, and I think also like I mean, there was I think a sense of like intellectualizing a lot of music that could be in a lot of ways just kind of disregarded. One thing I think of is porno grind, and your chapter on that kind of goes into a debate about like ethics and law and how morality kind of defines our law, and you're referencing Nietzsche, and it seems like it goes in this like tangent. I was wondering at some point, did you ever feel like you were stretching a bit, or did you ever feel
Mhm.
like, no, I'm fully committed? I really believe there's more merit to this than, maybe you get at first blush.
Are you thinking of the chapter about vulgar music
Yeah,
and
it was the
corporate?
vulgar music, but in general, I think a lot of these musics, just throughout the book, that could be disregarded. You do kind of link to you give it artistic merit by linking it to a lot of artistic movements,
Hmm.
particularly Dadaism, which I think
Yep.
a lot of these artistic movements are anti-consumerist, they're anti, they're anti, I guess, capitalist in some ways, and a lot of them serve as a critique of that. I think that's the underlying linchpin, I guess, of a lot of these
Hmm.
genres.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering, like, did you feel like, I don't know, did you feel like at times, did you ever second guess yourself if you were like putting too much, like an English teacher putting too much meaning behind the artwork?
Yeah, well, I think the situations in which Dada and anti-art come up, they're largely focused around like the anti-records, the silent records, the broken records chapters, and I think I don't think I've imposed that way of interpreting the music on the music, but rather a lot of the artists who've created anti-records, they themselves identify this as being in the tradition of Dada anti-art, and they also recognize the inherent contradictions of putting out music that is collected by collectors while also making a statement against like consumption of material items. So I feel like in that circumstance, I approach the theory agnostically from by just taking the perspectives of the creators literally and exploring the ideas. Though I think you could make the case that some of the theoretical, like in the vulgar section about gore grind and porn grind, I think those genres, I impose this way of looking at it by exploring the history of transgressive art. So I think you could make more of an argument that that's an idea that I'm imposing on the subject matter. And I don't know if it's a stretch. Maybe it is. I thought it made sense to me, but yeah, it may not to other people. So it's a good question.
Talk about the harsh wall noise and how a lot of times the artists would kind of set up loop pedals and kind of just let it run, go off, do errands, and then kind of come back and hit stop.
Yeah.
But one thing I noted here, you kind of linked that to the painting, industrial painting by Pino Galito, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, probably not. I was wondering, do you have any kind of interpretation on the idea of AI art and how that might influence music and culture, I guess, just going forward?
Yeah, someone just asked me this question oddly earlier today. What do you like, what do you think the future is for AI and music? Um, I think in the short term, the area of music that's most likely to be affected will be like, you know, instrumental electronic algorithmic playlists that people listen to in Spotify as background music, like what Eric Satie would call furniture music. Like that stuff is ripe to be it's 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 perfect to be developed by AI because the music doesn't involve acoustic instruments and there's often no lyrics. So I feel like that's where we might see this. I think that a lot of music consumers are pretty invested in the personalities behind the music that they're consuming. So it's hard for me to imagine the top 40 being dominated by AI music anytime soon, except maybe like the odd novelty hit now and then. And I also think people are pretty in like not everyone, but a lot of consumers of music are invested in the acoustic sound of instruments, which I think is going to be a while before that's replaced by AI. And also, I get the sense that maybe apart from some of the big popular artists, like a lot of musicians' revenue stream comes from live performance, like a live band. And like, I can't imagine how AI will replace that, but I don't know, robots performing music, maybe.
Well, I
Though I
mean, I
guess
guess if it's AI, they wouldn't need a financial, backing.
right.
So
Yeah. I guess it's just like I don't know that it's going to put live musicians out of business, but
sure.
what do I know?
So you don't. So it's not something you really worry about, I guess, then, because like I think a lot of people, a lot of artists are worrying about that. I think it's some people are embracing it, I guess. I mean, it reminds me, I don't know why, but the link I think of is if you remember the NFT craze, where it's like it just
Hmm.
seemed very divisive amongst artists. Some people embraced it, some people had scorn for it. And yeah, I think like AI is sort of in that similar field where it seems like everyone kind of has to have an opinion somewhat. But from your perspective, you don't really see it as affecting, I guess, at least in lives. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hardly an expert in this topic. I've listened to some of I imagine you have too, some of the AI generated music that the clips that have been produced and they're interesting.
Yeah.
But I don't know, like, yeah, I don't know. I guess at this point, I'd probably be more worried if I was a songwriter or producer for like popular music
Yeah.
than a live performer in a popular independent band. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and when you were doing this book, you interviewed various different artists from different genres, and as well as like record producers, and obviously and label owners. And obviously, from my perspective, I was very interested in the kind of the contrast between people who were doing the kind of regular jobs. You spoke to people who were like carpenters in like Italy, and I
Mhm.
spoke to so many various people. I was wondering, like, do you feel like I don't know. I wonder like how did those interviews influence the direction of the book? And did you have like a certain idea of the beats of the book, let's say, and then did they kind of get rerouted once the interviews took place?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. The book would evolve as I'd learn more from the people I was interviewing, because you like before you hear the words of the people behind the music, you often carry all of these assumptions about where they're coming from, and then you might be completely wrong, right?
Yeah,
Um, so when I would interview people, I would always ask them, whether it was an email interview or, Zoom or Skype or whatever, I'd ask, like, tell me about your life outside of making music. Roughly how old are you? What do you do? Do you have family? And I'd say, like, you can tell me as much as you want, like, respect your privacy, but tell me what you can. Because a big part of, like, when we hear about someone making harsh noise while we know nothing about them, we our mental image fills out so much when we find out just a little bit about who this person is, right?
yeah,
Are they a 20-something university student? Are they a 40-something carpenter? And it really, I just find like that helps us feel a sense of story, which is ultimately what makes most writing interesting, I think.
yeah. And when you were talking about like there's a lot also talk about some of the ethics of some of these music. Like one of the big genres was found tapes, which is
Hmm.
essentially people going to thrift stores or just picking up tapes in the middle of like a street or something, or like a garbage can. And you talk and it's these are like people's diaries or they're people's voicemail recordings or whatever. And you kind of discuss the ethics of that. And I was wondering, do you think like when you think of like people's privacy, is that in any way influenced by perhaps your occupation? Maybe you're a bit more sensitive to confidentiality in that sense.
Hmm. Yes, I mean that's definitely true that I'm concerned about confidentiality of the information that I come across at work. I think so. I mean, I don't know, one of the examples of the found music was those tapes by someone who obviously had some form of psychotic disorder and would kind of dictate these um monologues.
Yeah,
And then, that was released as a piece of music that you could get through a record label. On one hand, it's not clear that the person didn't want the audio to be listened to, but on the other hand, you wonder about the person's sort of capacity to understand the situation and make so that, there's an obvious ethical dilemma there because it's a potentially vulnerable person. And are people listening because they're interested in what the person's saying or because it's fascinating or funny or something to listen to, someone's psychotic monologue?
yeah.
So maybe that is something that I'm attuned to from my work, but like I feel like that's sort of an obvious ethical question, right?
Yeah. Well, now with kind of public recording and YouTube and even Twitter and stuff, like we do see that on a kind of
Hmm.
day-to-day
It's
basis, and
true.
we see the kind of ethics about that. I mean, like people do kind of defend the people in the video. Yeah, at the same time, I think there is also a tendency to publicly laugh at people with clear mental health issues. I think of someone like a Kanye West or an Alex Jones, where it's like,
Hmm.
clearly people who need a kind of help but are entertaining in the right amount of way, I guess. So people, I don't know, people still see them as kind of, because they're public figures, they're kind of, I don't know, they're kind of fair game, I guess.
Yeah, I guess if someone is making public statements, if someone's putting up their own things on the internet, that's a bit different from finding a tape that wasn't meant to be publicly distributed and publicly distributing it. So I do think there's a difference there. And I guess the thing is, people like Kanye West sort of drown out these obscure tapes from like, so no one's few people are paying attention to these tapes, fortunately. Instead, they're paying attention to the media cycle.
Yeah, but from your perspective, when you think about, I'd like to get your pick your brain about the copyright of aspect of it. So, one of the examples you gave in the found tapes was someone who recorded their next door neighbors who had alcohol issues and
Hmm.
recorded them having drunken kind of arguments.
Hmm.
Clearly, people who were in a strenuous relationship and simultaneously had the kind of demon of alcohol, the alcohol
Hmm.
addiction attached to. Yeah, but simultaneously, you can argue, well, the person who recorded that, it's their copyright, even, and you can kind of debate the ethics around that. I was wondering,
Hmm.
what do you think of the kind of copyright element of it, and simultaneously now, as media is becoming so global, there is no global standard for copyright. I think this has been an issue ever since the Pirate Bay days.
Hmm.
So yeah, I was wondering how you think like issues like that will kind of, do you even think about issues like that, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, copyright is law, right? And ethics are separate from the law. They don't necessarily aren't
Yeah,
necessarily overlapping perfectly. And so when it comes to that recording, which again, the recording of the person who is intoxicated and trying to repair a piano and swearing.
yeah,
That was something that started off as like the local equivalent to a viral video before the internet, right? Like someone made a tape and then at some point someone burned it to CDR and sold it at a few local record stores. Um, that the question of whether that's legal or not would depend, I think, like on the jurisdiction, right?
yeah,
Like some states it's legal to record someone without their knowledge. Some states it's not. Some countries it is. Some countries it's not. Um, Now that we're in a global world, I don't know how lawyers would try to sort that all out.
yeah,
Um, but the ethical question is a separate one, and I think that's the type like in that particular instance, this wasn't something that was meant to be spread widely, but it inadvertently did become widely distributed, which is probably unfortunate to the person, although I'm not sure they ever were aware that this recording existed.
yeah.
Um,
I think
but
it's also
yeah.
interesting when you have these long form recordings, you see people's reaction to it. I mean, people who put out, I forget the name of the record label, but the people who put out a lot of those lost tapes, like now kind of like, I probably wouldn't do it today. And even the guy
Hmm.
that you were talking about, the piano recording, that was, I believe, like a neighbor, like it was a friend of a neighbor.
Hmm.
And he didn't even know about it until he was like watching a documentary on Netflix and it popped up as like an antique viral video.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's interesting that kind of like, I guess people think about it more now. Like we're always kind of told we all have a digital footprint, and what we kind of put out there is kind of eternal. But I guess back in the 80s and 90s, 70s, even people weren't really thinking that long term, and now I don't know. It's I think it's interesting that like even though these are kind of obscure tapes and CDRs, they kind of persist still throughout all this. Do you have any opinion on that? Or
Yeah, they've come kind of become cult objects, right?
yeah,
And I guess nowadays, like the majority of people are going to be, they're going to want to see, I don't know, people getting into street fights on TikTok. I feel like few people these days are going to sit down and listen to like a 20-minute poorly recorded audio tape of someone swearing in the other room. It,
yeah,
it doesn't have the same novelty. Um, so I suspect these things really just appeal to a small number of people as cult objects from a bygone time.
yeah,
Though I think they're interesting to explore since that's like it's sort of like the prelude to viral videos, right?
yeah. Yeah, and I guess like yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the things covered in the book, I think a lot of it comes down to kind of novelty. Like you've also just gone off the music. You actually talk about the physical releases of a lot of these albums, the
Hmm.
world's smallest albums, world's longest albums, and that aspect too. And I think like in a way my sort of interpretation, and maybe this way you're getting at, and also, you talk about like long form, like millennia long songs, that are like going to be streaming from I think 1999 till 29.99, and it's like I feel like a lot of times this is just people's aversion to their own mortality. It feels like they want something that's kind of going to persist and be remembered and be documented in books such as yours. Do you think Do you think that's all there is, or do you think there's more to it than that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I discussed that in the chapter, but I think that's a good way of thinking about it, right? Like a sort of legacy, um, and like a legacy item, something that will live beyond them in time.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. I didn't have the ability, obviously, to interview John Cage, but yeah, that's a that's a interesting way of thinking about it.
Um, Most of your book, I think, is written in a very objective and just kind of matter of fact way, albeit a few choice adjectives to describe certain songs every now and again. But you do at the end of certain chapters do a curation of the topic discussed. So you say, here's some tracks or here's some albums to I would recommend if you're interested in this. Yeah, I was wondering like you were saying it's not a very academic book, but I think in a lot of ways there is that kind of academic detachment, and
Mm.
just like presenting things and not adding too much personal opinion. So I was wondering,
Mhm.
like, why did you think it was important to kind of curate for the audience?
Yeah. So you're wondering how I chose what to curate
No,
or
I was more
what
so
ends
wondering, yeah, why did you choose to curate to begin with? Because I feel like the rest of the book has somewhat of an objective approach.
right, like a agnosticism.
Pretty much, yeah.
In the chapters where I identified specific like specific records or things to check out, I think I still tried to take an objective stance. So I wasn't typically picking things that I thought sounded best. I would be picking things that by kind of sussing out the expert consensus on a topic, these were the things that were recognized as being like historically relevant or historically important. So an example being the speed core section, right? I think there's a list of some key records within speed core, splitter core, and extra tone.
Yeah.
And not being a personal member of that scene, the way I came to those was by talking to people and trying to figure out like what were the records that speedcore fans or speedcore artists consider important historically. So that was that would often be the metric I would use um, in order to select things. I guess there was also the gore grind um, section, and there I just chose the band names that were kind of the most absurdly long and specific. And as someone who's also had medical training, I think I was just sort of like tickled by all of this like arcane medical terminology being included.
Yeah, I have to be
Um,
honest, when I read that section where you were listing all the band names, stuff I did kind of just like, my eyes rolled over a little bit. It was just so dense.
yeah, it's like ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
Like it's an absurd. I think the people who make it realize it's absurd and it's just a fun thing. But yeah.
Do you think there's a lot of gallows humor too in this pursuit? Because there were times where I was really laughing at like just some of the absurdity of some of the things, and like it's knowing absurdity. It's not like you accidentally stumble upon,
Hmm.
making a record that would break your vinyl player. you know.
Hmm.
Yeah, I was wondering like if you could expand on that. Like, did you find it humorous to write about some of these things yourself?
Yeah, some things were really funny. I think most of the things were funny were knowingly funny. Like the people creating them were trying to be absurd and so I never felt like I was laughing at someone. I always felt like I was laughing with someone um for the most part, with the potential exception of some parts of the porn crime section,
Right.
which even I like. That's one place where my editorial objectivity shifts a bit, and I
Yeah.
kind of look and say, like, some of these things I object to on ethical or ideological grounds.
Yeah, you talk about the meat shits, and you say like these are homophobes. Like you're very objective about that. You go like well, not
Mhm,
objective. You're very clear about that. And you say like like let's not get it twisted here. Let's and I
mhm,
think that's like I think that was important. I think that's like important editorial stamping to go and go like let's draw a line in the sand here of like you can debate good taste. You can debate whether these records should be publicly available. I mean,
mhm,
you can call something out for being discriminatory without necessarily calling for censorship. I think some people lose sight of that. You know what I mean? I think
Hmm.
people like think I don't know, anyone who has a claim to like social justice is calling for censorship, which is just absurd. You know what I mean?
The one thing I chose to not include in the book was like any music that was affiliated with Nazi scenes, white power scenes, these sorts of scenes, and just because there are, there's examples of packaging, unusually packaged music, and within that genre, but it's just not something that not something that I consider integral to the concepts of the book, and B, not something that I like wanted to be in my book. So that was an editorial exclusion.
I think
But I
also
think
you probably want to spare yourself from having to listen to
yes, yes, yeah,
it.
that is also true. Although I didn't, I wouldn't have to listen to something to describe the packaging, but
Sure.
yes, that is a good point as well.
But also, I mean, like, do you think like because you were saying you were excluding like some of the like far right like extremist music, but do you think like even including that in the book is somewhat a tacit, not endorsement, but a tacit kind of incentive to seek this music out to hear for yourself. I think because like when I read books about music, I always feel obliged to kind of make a playlist of what they're
Hmm.
talking about so that I can have a greater
Hmm.
understanding. You know what I mean? Do you feel
Yeah,
that
that's
way? Sorry.
part of it is that I didn't want like A, I didn't want to explore myself, and B, yeah, I didn't want to be disseminating it.
Sure.
Um, yeah, there is actually a book about white power music written by someone who's like staunchly anti-racist,
Yeah.
but it talks about the history, and so that's also covered elsewhere. It doesn't really fit into the parameters of my book, and it just made sense to exclude anything that overlapped.
How long was the process of actually writing the book? Not necessarily even getting published, just writing the book. Because I see the footnotes and I see the access dates,
Right,
and
right.
I'm able to kind of get a picture of like okay, this chapter. I'm able to see it kind of folding
I
that
think
way.
the first interviews I did were back in 2016.
Okay.
And then it took place while I was doing my residency training, so in like weekends and evenings, up until 2020. I finished it off um, like at the peak of lockdown, in between when I finished my residency and when I started working as a staff physician. And then I submitted to publication then, and that took a while.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Is there any zest then to make any further publications, or are you just kind of like I just want to get this out?
Yeah, I mean, I have ideas for books that I think would be interesting topics, and I've even like done some initial interviews and research. My job is very busy, and I have a child, and so my life is very busy. So I have much less time than I used to work on this. And like my style was to write the book without necessarily having a publisher, and then see if anyone was interested.
Yeah.
So that's probably the tack I would take the second time around as well, because I think it would be really hard to manage under a deadline. But then again, maybe all books will be written by AI in a few years, and there's no point.
It'd make my job easier.
I,
Uh,
I think interviews are one thing that AI can't do. So you're safe.
oh, that's good.
Interview-based writing.
Yeah, and I guess this is the last thing I'll ask is: do you see the kind of art world and not just music exclusively, but just art in general? Do you see it as kind of limitless potential? And how do you think writing this book has, I guess, influenced your perception of, I guess, the limitlessness of art?
Wow. It's a great question and a hard one to answer. Is art limitless? A lot of the a lot of the One of the sort of things about a lot of extreme music is that it all becomes noise in the end.
Yeah,
Like all, if you take something to the fringe, it just turns into noise, which you see in speedcore, which you see in like loud music, which you see in kind of in soft music. Um so So I don't know. Are there an infinite number of ideas? Maybe. Or is a lot of music just stimulating permutations of like a constrained set of different parameters? Um, I'm not sure. But with that said, whether music is recycling old ideas and interpreting them in new ways or coming up with completely new things, it's always changing. It's always exciting. And so it'll be interesting to see what the future holds.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Aaron.
Appreciate it. Take care.
You too. Bye now.
Thank you for listening to that episode of Post-burnout.com interviews. We hope you enjoyed and stay tuned for more.